My name is Hannah Caldwell, and I'm 34 years old. The night my brother announced his promotion, nobody looked at me first. They looked at him like he had crossed a finish line. The rest of us had been too lazy to run. My mother pressed a hand to her chest, like the news healed something. My father, quieter every month now, just nodded from his chair by the window. I stood at the end of the dining table, holding a serving spoon, already knowing what was coming. Because in my family, every good thing that happened to someone else somehow turned into a bill addressed to me. Then my mother turned, smiled like she had already solved a problem nobody had agreed existed, and said, "You'll take Dad. Not. Would you be able to help with Dad not? Can we sit down and talk about Dad's care? Just an assignment." I set the spoon down and said, "Absolutely not." The room went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the next room. My brother's wife laughed once, short and sharp, and said, "You don't have a husband. You don't have kids. Honestly, taking care of Dad is the closest you'll ever get to having a family of your own." That was the moment something inside me stopped folding. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't stand there explaining my life to people who had already decided it was empty enough to fill with their leftovers. I picked up my keys, walked past every surprised face, and left. But the next morning, while I was still telling myself they would calm down and think it through, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. "Hello. Is this Hannah Caldwell? This is Mr. Caldery. Hayes, a discharge coordinator at Maplewood Care Center. Your father was brought in this morning with paperwork stating you'd agreed to take him home today. Before I tell you what he said next, and what happened after I walked out of that dinner, tell me something first. What time is it where you are right now? What's the weather like outside your window? And how far from home are you watching this? I want to know how far this story is going to travel. Because to understand why one phone call cracked something open in me, you need to understand that this was not the first time my family had treated my life like an empty room they could store their responsibilities in. My mother was Linda, a woman who could make a demand sound like a blessing and a guilt trip sound like wisdom. My brother was Greg, the golden one, the one whose every move was treated like an accomplishment. His wife was Brittany, who measured other people's worth by how useful they were to her. My sister was Danielle, married, 2 kids, perpetually swamped. And my father was Walter, 71, who had started forgetting where he put his glasses, then forgetting whole conversations, and who deserved real care. Not a guilt-powered arrangement built around the family member with the least leverage. I loved my father. That was exactly the thing they counted on. When Dad had his first dizzy spell, I was the one called away from a client deadline because, as Mom put it, you can work from anywhere. When his license was taken away, Greg said, "You're better at handling appointments anyway." And just like that, his neurology visits became my standing obligation. When Dad needed help organizing his medications, my mother told the whole extended family that I had offered to manage his care, which somehow turned into me spending 3 weekends sorting pill boxes and cleaning out his fridge while Greg posted vacation photos and Danielle said parenting was a full-time job. 2. Every time I set a limit, they acted betrayed. Every time I gave in, they called it love. So when Greg announced his promotion and his move 2 states away, my body understood before my mind did. They weren't celebrating his career. They were quietly deciding who would absorb the cost of it. And the cost had a name. Mine. After I left the dinner, my phone started buzzing before I reached the highway. My mother, "Don't you dare make this about you." Greg, "You upset Mom." Real classy. Brittany, "Selfish, doesn't even cover it." Danielle, "Some of us actually have responsibilities." Hannah, I ignored every message. The next morning, I met my closest friend, Nora, at a coffee shop near my apartment. Because she was the one person in my life who had never treated my boundaries as a personal attack. I had barely sat down before she looked at me and said, "They did it again." "Didn't they?" I told her everything. Greg's promotion. The way they crowned him. My mother volunteering me to take in our father like he was a piece of furniture. And Brittany's line about caregiving being the closest thing to a family I'd ever have. Nora listened, then set her cup down and said, "Hannah, this isn't asking for help anymore. This is ownership." I wanted to argue with her. I couldn't. Then my phone lit up again. My mother. When I didn't answer, she texted, "Come to the house this afternoon. We need to correct your attitude before it turns into a real problem for this family." Nora told me not to go. She said people like that don't want a conversation. They want a surrender they can call peace. But part of me still believed that if I explained myself clearly enough, calmly enough, with enough proof that I was a whole person and not a backup plan, they would finally hear me. So I drove to my parents' house. The moment I stepped inside, my mother was in the kitchen pouring lemonade like she was hosting a garden party instead of an ambush. Greg sat at the table, already moved on. Scrolling through his phone, Brittany leaned against the counter with the satisfied stillness of someone who thinks the outcome is already decided. Danielle perched on a stool, sighing before anyone had even spoken. And my father sat alone in the next room. In front of a television, he wasn't really watching. "Hannah," my mother said, "we're not asking for much. You're not asking at all." I replied. Greg looked up. "Don't be so dramatic. Nobody's saying you have to do it forever." Brittany crossed her arms. "Just until Greg settled in the new city. A year. Maybe 2. It's not like your life is exactly full. That is not a small favor." I said, "That is a person's entire care." My mother sighed like I was a teenager, refusing to do a chore. "You work from home. You rent a 1-bedroom. No husband. No children." "What?" "Exactly. Are you protecting so fiercely?" That sentence landed harder than any insult could have. Because it was the purest version of what they all believed. My life didn't look like theirs. So to them, it counted for less. It was empty square footage they were entitled to claim. I said, "I'm protecting myself." Greg scoffed. "From your own family. From being swallowed by people who only call it family when they need something carried." The room went rigid. Then my phone rang. A number I didn't know. I almost silenced it. But something made me answer. "Hello, Acom." Careful voice said, "Is this Ms.? Hannah Caldwell. This is Mr. Hayes, a discharge coordinator at Maplewood Care Center. Are you aware that your father, Walter Caldwell, was brought in this morning, and that there's a note stating you agreed to take responsibility for his care starting today?" I looked at Greg. His face shifted before anyone said a word. Just a flicker. A tightening at the jaw. But it was enough. "What note?" I asked. Though I already knew. "Mr. Hayes continued, "There's a handwritten note saying you'd accepted full caregiving responsibility for your father and would be picking him up this afternoon. Our staff became concerned because no one completed the intake properly. And the person who brought him in left before we could confirm the arrangement." My mother reached for the edge of the counter. Danielle suddenly found the floor very interesting. Greg said, "It's not a big deal." And that was the moment I understood the whole design. They hadn't simply assumed I would obey. They had built a situation where saying no would make me look like a monster. They had handed my father to strangers in my name, betting that my love for him would override every instinct to protect myself. I left my parents' house without another word. Because if I'd stayed, I might have said something that would have turned the story into a fight about my temper instead of a record of their choices. Mr. Hayes asked if I could come to Maplewood to clarify the situation. And I told him yes. But then I said something I had never said to an official before. I wanted on record that I did not consent to take responsibility for my father's care, and that I was never asked. There was a brief pause. Then he said, "Understood. Ms. Caldwell, please drive safely." Greg followed me out to the porch, dropping his voice like he was offering me a gift. "Don't make this into a whole thing." I turned back. "You made it a whole thing when you handed our father to strangers and signed my name to it." He rolled his eyes. "He's your dad too. Then why did you leave him with a note instead of with me?" He had no answer. That silence rode with me the entire drive to Maplewood. My mind dragged me backward through years of quiet thefts, weekends taken because Greg needed a break, vacation days spent in waiting rooms, my mother telling relatives, "Hannah is just wonderful with her father," while never mentioning that I sometimes cried in the parking garage afterward. Exhausted and completely unseen. At Maplewood, the woman at the front desk recognized my name before I gave it. "He's in the family room," she said gently. "Mr. Hayes is sitting with him." I walked down a hallway lined with cheerful watercolor paintings and a bulletin board of residents' birthdays, and the warmth of the place somehow made the situation feel even uglier. My father sat in a soft chair by the window, a small overnight bag at his feet that someone had packed for him. He was holding the strap with both hands, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to let go. When he saw me, his whole face changed with relief. "Hannah," he said, and his voice cracked. "They told me I was going to live with you now. Is that right?" I didn't want to be a bother. That nearly destroyed me. I knelt beside him. But I didn't make a promise I couldn't keep. People who are confused and frightened deserve gentleness, not comfortable lies. I said, "I'm here, Dad, and we're going to figure out the right plan together. None of this is your fault." "Mr. Hayes handed me a clear plastic sleeve with the note inside. "Is this handwriting familiar to you?" I knew before I finished the first line. It was my mother's. The note read, "Hannah Caldwell has agreed to take full responsibility for her father. Vieta. Effective today. She is his daughter and has no other obligations. The rest of the family is occupied with work and children. Please contact Hannah for anything regarding his care." I read the words "has no other obligations" 3 times. It wasn't a note. It was a confession. My mother had written down exactly what she thought my life was worth and handed it to strangers in a plastic sleeve. "Mr. Hayes asked, "Did you agree to this arrangement?" "Verbally, or in writing?" "No." "Have you been your father's caregiver before?" I took a slow breath. "I've helped. Appointments. Medication. Errand. Sometimes because I was pressured into it, but I have never agreed to be his full-time caregiver, his legal guardian, his emergency placement, or to take him into my home." He nodded and wrote it down. "Do you have any messages showing that you declined?" "Yes." I pulled out my phone and showed him the texts from the night before, including my own. "Absolutely not. My mother's. Don't you dare make this about you. And Brittany's selfish doesn't even cover it." Mr. Hayes's expression changed at that last one. He explained that the center could not simply transfer responsibility for a vulnerable adult to me because a relative left a note. Staff had grown alarmed because my father had been brought in and effectively left before any proper intake, and the person who delivered him had not completed the required paperwork or stayed to confirm anything. That detail mattered. He said, "My family hadn't even had the courage to walk in, sit down, and say their lie out loud." "What happens now?" I asked. "We'll contact the people responsible for bringing him here. If a safe arrangement can't be confirmed, Adult Protective Services may become involved." You are not required to accept responsibility. And to be clear, if you don't consent, you should not take him home simply to make the situation go away. I looked at my father, still gripping that bag strap like it was the only solid thing in the room. My family had gambled that my love for him would be stronger than my will to protect my own life. He looked up at me. Your mother said you wanted me with you. I closed my eyes for a second. I want you safe and cared for. Dad. Always. But grown-ups aren't allowed to lie about who agreed to take care of you. Mr. Hayes asked if I wanted to wait while he contacted my family. I said yes. Then I quietly took photos of the note, screenshots of the messages, and a picture of the visitor log showing the time my father had been dropped off. I wanted justice, but not the screaming, table-flipping kind. I wanted something cleaner. I wanted the truth to become impossible to rewrite. If you've ever been forced to choose between protecting someone you love and protecting yourself, tell me in the comments what you would have done. Because that exact question circled my head while I sat in that quiet family room waiting for my own relatives to arrive and meet the consequences of their lie. Greg arrived first. Angry. Because anger was easier to carry than shame. Brittany came in behind him, already shaking her head as if I were the unreasonable one. My mother arrived last, dressed like she was going to church, because she always liked to look respectable while doing something ugly. Danielle stayed in the car. My father's care had apparently not been important enough to interrupt her afternoon. Mr. Hayes asked them to step into a small meeting room. I was included because my name was on the note. Greg opened with, "This is all just a family misunderstanding." Mr. Hayes glanced at the note. A misunderstanding usually doesn't involve leaving a vulnerable adult at a facility and driving away before intake is complete. Brittany's jaw tightened. He wasn't abandoned. Hannah was supposed to come get him. I never agreed to come get him, I said. My mother turned to me with the disappointed look she had sharpened over a lifetime. Hannah, this is not the time for your stubbornness. A frightened 71-year-old man had been left with strangers. A care center had nearly called Adult Protective Services. And somehow, in my mother's mind, my boundary was the crisis. Mr. Hayes asked who had written the note. Nobody spoke. Then he looked directly at my mother. Mrs. Caldwell. She lifted her chin. I wrote it because Hannah has always helped. She's wonderful with her father. He's comfortable with her. That wasn't my question. He said, "Did she agree to take responsibility for him today?" My mother's mouth opened, then closed. Greg jumped in. She was being difficult, but we knew she'd come around. She always does. So she refused, Mr. Fievel? Hayes asked. She was emotional. Brittany said, "That isn't a yes." I said. Greg glared at me. "You're really going to do this in front of a stranger?" "No." I said, "You did this when you packed our father a bag and left him at a care center with my name on a note." The room went still. For the first time, the sentence sounded exactly as bad as the thing it described. My mother reached for the softer weapon. "Hannah, sweetheart, no one meant any harm. You're just so good with him. Greg is under so much pressure with the move. Danielle has the children. We all have so much. Then you should have planned for all of it before celebrating Greg's promotion, like it had no cost." Brittany gasped. Greg leaned forward. "Mr. Hayes said evenly. Sid, please stay seated." Greg sat, but his face had gone red. "You've always resented me," he said. "You can't stand that I built a life and you didn't." There it was again. The emptiness they assigned to me so they could justify filling it with labor. I kept my voice level. "No. Greg, I can't stand that you keep building a life on the assumption that I'll quietly carry whatever you don't want to." My mother slapped her palm lightly on the table. "Enough. You will apologize to your brother. I turned to Mr. Hayes. I want it documented that I am not my father's caregiver. Legal guardian. Emergency contact. Or placement. Unless I personally agree in writing. He nodded and wrote it down. Greg laughed bitterly. You're making yourself look heartless. I took out my phone. No. I'm making myself clear. Then I read the messages aloud. One after another. Don't you dare make this about you. Selfish doesn't even cover it. Some of us actually have responsibilities. Brittany tried to interrupt. Mr. Hayes asked her to wait. My mother's face shifted with each sentence that landed in that small room. She had expected me flustered, apologetic, cornered by guilt. She had not expected evidence. That was my first real taste of a different kind of power. Not revenge as destruction, but revenge as documentation. Mr. Hayes explained that my father needed to be picked up by someone who would actually take responsibility for him, and that the incident would be recorded. He added that if there were repeated attempts to leave a vulnerable adult without a confirmed, consenting caregiver, a referral to Adult Protective Services could follow. Greg's confidence cracked. A referral? Are you serious? When a dependent adult is left without confirmed care? Yes. Mr. Hayes said. Brittany started to cry. Not over what they'd done to my father, but because consequences had finally walked into the room. My mother whispered, Hannah, look what you're causing. A year earlier. That sentence would have flattened me. But sitting there with her handwriting sealed in a plastic sleeve and her lies on the record, I finally saw the trick, clearly. They caused the harm, then handed me the shame to carry. I said, I didn't cause this. I just refused to hide it for you. Greg leaned in. If you walk away from this, I'll tell everyone you abandoned Dad. I'll make sure the whole family knows what kind of daughter you are. I smiled, and I think that frightened him more than shouting would have. Then I'll show them the note. My mother stared at me like she was looking at a stranger. Maybe she was. The old Hannah would have folded. The old Hannah would have taken Dad home, set up the guest room, cried in the shower, and apologized to everyone by Sunday. The woman sitting in that meeting room was finished paying for love with obedience. When the meeting ended, Greg and my mother had to make an actual plan for our father themselves. That day, in person. Before I left, I sat with Dad for a few minutes. I held his hand and told him I wasn't angry with him, that none of this was his doing. He asked, quietly, Are you still my daughter? Even if you're not the one taking me home. I kissed the top of his head. Always. But the adults in this family have to start telling the truth. Outside, no one apologized. My mother only said, I hope you're happy with the scene you made. I drove away while my phone began to detonate. By the time I got home, there were 19 missed calls, dozens of texts, and a voicemail from my mother that opened with, I hope you can live with yourself, which told me everything I needed to know. I didn't call back. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and wrote the most important letter of my life. It wasn't emotional. That was the point. Emotion was the thing they knew how to twist. Facts were harder to bend. I wrote, I neither. Hannah Caldwell. Do not consent to be listed. Named. Implied. Or represented as a caregiver. Legal guardian. Emergency contact. Financial sponsor. Or placement for Walter Caldwell without my prior written agreement for a specific defined arrangement. I added that any future attempt to leave my father in my care without my consent would be reported to the appropriate authorities. I attached the photo of the note, the screenshots, and my refusal texts. I emailed it to my mother, Greg, Brittany, and Danielle. and blind copied myself. Then I saved everything in a folder labeled Family Boundary Documentation. It felt cold. It also felt like the first full breath I'd taken in years. Then I called Nora. She picked up on the first ring. "Tell me you didn't bring him home tonight." "I didn't." She exhaled. "Good. I'm proud of you." That sentence arrived without a single hook attached to it. 2 days later, my cousin Paige sent me a screenshot from a family group chat I'd muted long ago. Greg had written, "Hannah abandoned Dad at a care facility because she's bitter about my promotion." Brittany added, "Some people are too selfish to put family first." My mother had replied with a folded hands emoji and the words, "We are heartbroken by the choices she's making." Then the relatives joined in. Aunt Carol shameful. Uncle Frank, "Your grandparents would be ashamed." Someone I barely knew wrote, "This is what happens when a woman has no family of her own to care about." I stared at the screen and felt the old heat rise. But it wasn't guilt this time. It was precision. I asked Paige, "Are they telling people I agreed to take Dad and then backed out?" She replied, "Yes. Greg says you bailed at the last second." So I did exactly what Nora had told me to do. I wrote one message and posted it to the group chat. For the record, I never agreed to take responsibility for Dad's care. He was left at a care center with a note falsely claiming I had accepted it. A discharge coordinator documented that I did not consent. I won't discuss the details of his health publicly, but I will correct false claims about what I agreed to. Then I attached a single image, the note, with my father's medical details covered. But my mother's sentence left visible. She is his daughter and has no other obligations. Silence. For 9 perfect minutes. Nobody typed. Then Paige sent me a private message. "Oh my God." Aunt Carol deleted her comment. Uncle Frank left the chat. My mother called immediately. I let it ring. Greg texted, "Take that down." I replied, "Stop lying." He wrote, "You're humiliating, Mom." I replied, "Mom wrote it." That was the second taste of power. The first had been documentation. The second was refusing to protect people from the truth of their own handwriting. But the group chat was only the start. A neighbor had apparently seen my mother and Greg leaving Maplewood that morning. Word reached people at their church. Suddenly the question circulating wasn't, "Can you believe Hannah?" It was, "Why was Walter left at a care center without a real plan?" The story had flipped. And it had flipped because of facts they couldn't charm their way past. Then Mr. Tynet in Nestor. Hayes called again. His voice more serious this time. "Ms. Caldwell, we've received conflicting statements from your family. Some are now claiming you were part of an agreed care rotation and simply failed to show up." I almost laughed at the desperation of it. "That's false. Do you have written communication showing you declined before your father was dropped off?" "Yes. Several. Please send them to the case file. We'd also recommend you submit a written statement." My fingers went cold. But not from fear. From clarity. My family had tried to turn my refusal into neglect. Now the very evidence they'd ignored was becoming the thing that protected both me and my father. That night I wrote my statement. I included dates. Prior incidents. The times I'd been pressured. The times I'd refused. And the times I had genuinely helped, while making clear that help had always been temporary, and by my choice. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't need to. The truth was already heavy enough. When I finished, I read the final line twice. I love my father. But love for a parent must never be used to manufacture consent from an adult child who was never asked. If that sentence struck something in you, ask yourself this. How many times have you called it love when it was really guilt, wearing the family name? The official meeting happened the following week at Maplewood. And this time I didn't go alone. Nora came with me. Not to speak for me, but to sit beside me as living proof that I had someone in my corner who gained nothing from my silence. Mr. Hayes was there, along with the center's director, Ms. Calloway, and an adult protective services intake worker named Teresa. Greg and my mother arrived late. My mother came carrying a folder like an attorney, though I later learned it held nothing but printed photos of me with my father at holidays and birthdays, as if smiling beside him in a photograph proved I had signed up to run his life. Danielle came too, and sat in the back, looking like she wished she were anywhere else. Ms. Calloway began by explaining that the meeting was meant to establish safe procedures and clarify responsibility. Greg pounced on the word immediately. Exactly. Hannah is making this sound criminal. But it was a misunderstanding. Teresa asked, "Who physically brought Mr. Caldwell to the center and left him?" Nobody answered. Ms. Calloway checked her notes. Staff recorded a woman matching Mrs. Linda Caldwell's description, leaving the entrance at approximately 9:20 that morning, before intake was completed. My mother stiffened. I walked him inside. "You did not complete intake," Ms. Calloway said, "and you left before staff could confirm a consenting caregiver." Danielle murmure. "Mom, you told us it was all arranged." My mother shot her a look, and for the first time I saw a crack open between them. Manipulation only works while everyone agrees to share the same story. Under questioning, their accounts began to drift apart. Greg said Mom had offered to handle the arrangement. My mother said she'd been certain I would do the right thing, because I always had. Danielle admitted she'd known. I said no at dinner, but assumed I'd give in once Dad was involved. Teresa wrote it all down. Their own words were building the record more thoroughly than mine ever could. Then my mother slid her folder of photographs across the table. "Look at these. Hannah loves her father. She's always been involved." Teresa looked at the pictures politely. Loving a parent does not create legal responsibility without consent. I wanted to frame that sentence and hang it on a wall. Greg rubbed his forehead. Brittany wasn't there, but Danielle had started to cry. And for once the tears sounded less like performance and more like fear. "So what happens now?" she asked. Teresa explained that the family would need to provide a verified care plan for my father, with named consenting caregivers or professional services, and written confirmation from anyone listed. Until then, no one could deposit him anywhere under an unverified arrangement. Adult Protective Services would not remove him or take action based on this single incident. But the report would stay on file. If there were another attempt to leave him without confirmed care, it could escalate into a formal neglect inquiry. Greg looked at me like I had personally invented these consequences. "Are you satisfied?" I answered honestly. "I'm relieved." "Ms. Calloway turned to me. "Ms. Caldwell, would you like to be removed from all caregiving records and listed only as a relative with no responsibility or pickup authority?" "Yes," I said. Immediately. Danielle looked panicked. "But what if there's an emergency with Dad?" I looked at her steadily. "Then you call someone who has actually agreed to be his emergency contact," she said, quietly. "We don't have anyone else." And there it was. The truth? Finally out loud. They had no plan because their plan had always, only, been me. Teresa offered information on home care agencies, respite services, and a financial consultation for professional caregiving. Greg looked openly offended at the phrase paid care, as though strangers deserved wages, but I had merely owed them my life. My mother tried one final time. "Hannah, please, don't tear this family apart over paperwork." I turned to her. "Paperwork is the only reason you can't lie about me anymore." The meeting ended with signatures. Nobody had expected forms, acknowledgments, and written restrictions. The revenge wasn't loud. It was blue ink on white paper. Greg and my mother had to sign that they understood I was not my father's caregiver. My mother had to sign a statement, acknowledging she had no authority to assign his care to me without my consent. Afterward, Danielle caught me near the exit. "Did you really have to post the note? Did you really have to let them tell everyone I abandoned Dad?" She looked down. I was overwhelmed. So was everyone? Her face finally crumpled. Because someone had said out loud that the whole family had been overwhelmed. Including me. She whispered. "Greg said you'd cave. He always says you'll cave." "I know. And Mom said this would finally give my life some meaning." I swallowed the anger in my throat. My life already had meaning. You all just never respected it. She didn't apologize. But she stopped defending it. That was the first honest thing she'd offered me in years. When I walked outside, my mother was waiting by my car. "You've changed," she said. I opened the door. "No. Mom." I just stopped translating disrespect into duty. Then I drove home with the windows down. Even though the evening was cold, because for the first time in years I wanted to feel the air move around me without asking anyone's permission. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves. And each wave carried off another piece of the version of my family that had survived only on appearances. First, the care center required a complete, verified plan for my father before any further drop-offs or services. That meant naming real caregivers, providing signatures, and meeting with a coordinator. Greg complained that bureaucracy was tearing the family apart. Nobody said it to his face. But people noticed that bureaucracy was simply the word he used for rules he couldn't charm his way around. Second, my mother's reputation took a hit she never saw coming. For years, she had been the wise matriarch. The woman relatives called for advice about keeping a family together, but the screenshot of her note changed the way people heard her voice. She is his daughter and has no other obligations. Those few words traveled farther than any speech I could have given. Aunt Carol sent me a quiet apology. Paige told me cousins had started comparing notes and realized my mother had pulled smaller versions of this on other people for years. Assigning tasks, rewriting agreements, using guilt as a calendar. Third, Greg and my mother had to actually arrange and pay for the care they had spent so long trying to outsource to me. With the center watching the paperwork and relatives suddenly wary of being volunteered, they had no choice but to hire professional help. The cost stunned them. Greg quietly delayed part of his celebratory move. My mother, who had spent years insisting families should never pay strangers for what relatives could do, found herself interviewing home aides. I almost replied to one of her complaints with, "Family support didn't disappear. Free labor resigned." I didn't. Sometimes growth means letting the obvious lines stay unsent. A few months later, something shifted. My father was placed with a steady, kind daytime aide and a real schedule. And his good days started outnumbering his bad ones. Because now his care was built on a plan instead of on guilt. Greg called me one evening. And for once he didn't open with a demand. He said, "We've got a coordinator handling Dad's care now. I'm not calling to ask you for anything." There was a long pause. Then, "Would you maybe want to come see him? As his daughter? No strings." I knew what that invitation used to mean. It used to mean, "Are you ready to be useful again?" So I answered carefully, "I'd love to see Dad. I'm not available to manage his care. But I'd love to visit him." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay. That's fair." That word, fair, wasn't an apology, but it was a border. And he'd finally stopped trying to step over it. I visited on a Sunday afternoon, with Nora waiting at a cafe nearby. Because I still didn't fully trust the room, my father was in his chair by the window, calmer than I'd seen him in a long time. My mother was there too. And when I arrived, she didn't hand me a list of his medications or a schedule of his appointments. She simply asked, stiffly, "Would you like some time alone with him?" Asked. That single word mattered more than any apology she could have managed. I said yes. I sat with my father and held his hand. And for a while, neither of us needed to say anything. At one point he looked at me, clear-eyed in that moment, and said, "You always took such good care of me. I hope I never made you feel like you had to." My eyes burned, but I smiled. "You didn't. Dad? Other people did. We're fixing that now." Greg never apologized. Neither did Brittany. My mother came closest one afternoon when she said, "I suppose I assumed too much from you. For too long." It was the smallest possible admission. But it proved the old pattern could no longer continue the same way. That's the part people don't always understand about this kind of revenge. The most satisfying version isn't watching someone collapse. Sometimes it's watching them learn that access to you comes with terms. Sometimes it's hearing a person who once handed you commands finally learn how to ask. I didn't become cold. I became clear. I still loved my father. I still visited. I still sat with him on quiet Sundays and brought him the licorice he liked. But I visited when I chose to, left when I needed to, and never again accepted a responsibility just because someone said it at my feet and walked away. Even the family group chat changed. When someone needed help now, people had started using actual words. "Are you available? Would you be willing to?" It was almost funny how revolutionary plain consent sounded in a family that had preached love for decades. 1 year after the morning at Maplewood, I moved into a small condo I bought myself. Not large. Not fancy. Mine. On the first night, I sat on the floor, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, eating takeout, and opened the folder labeled Family Boundary Documentation one last time. I thought I'd feel bitterness. Instead, I felt gratitude for the woman who had been afraid and acted anyway. The one who answered Mr. Packetak, Hayes's call and chose truth over comfort. The one who looked at a frightened old man gripping an overnight bag and refused to let love be turned into a weapon against her. I archived the folder. I didn't delete it. Some lessons deserve to be kept somewhere you can find them again. Then I turned off my phone and slept better than I had in years. So, if you're listening to this and you're the dependable one, the single one, the one without kids, the quiet one, the one everyone praises only when you're useful, hear me clearly. Your life is not spare storage for other people's responsibilities. Your love is not consent. Your guilt is not a contract. And real family does not need to trap you in order to keep you close. Tell me in the comments. What would you have done if your own family tried to turn your boundary into abandonment? Because I used to believe that walking away would destroy everything. It didn't. It only destroyed the version of the family that needed me to disappear. We hope this story gave you both feeling and a lesson worth holding on to. This video is entirely fictional and created only for entertainment, educational, and reflective purposes. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Leaving a situation that constantly disrespects you may hurt at first, but staying in it can cost you far more. A blank space in someone's life is not an invitation for others to write their needs across it. For years, my family looked at my unmarried life, my quiet apartment, my flexible work, and saw an empty page they could fill without asking. But a life does not become less complete because it does not look traditional. A woman without a husband or children is not unfinished. She is not public property. She is not the family's emergency room with the lights always on. That note at Maplewood taught me something paperwork had always known better than people. Consent must be specific, honest, and freely given. Love can make you show up, but it cannot be used to forge your yes. Responsibility is not real when it is assigned in someone else's handwriting. And the day I put the truth on record, I did not stop being my father's daughter. I stopped being the place where everyone else hid from their duty. Scriptwriter Win Van Chien.